Welcome to this afternoon's water colloquium. The colloquium is put on each month during the academic semester, 4 times in the fall and 4 times in the spring. It's generously supported by several deans, the Dean of the College of Natural Resources, the Dean of Engineering, and the Dean of the Law School. And it's enabled us over several years now to bring an extraordinary group of speakers to the campus to talk about various aspects of water, scientific, legal, engineering, and historical. The next month's seminar, let me just mention that, will be given 4 weeks from now on Tuesday, December 7th, by Robert Glennon, who's a law professor, professor of water law at the University of Arizona, who wrote a very fine book called Water Follies, and that'll be the title of his talk next month. Linda, do you want to say a word?
Thank you. My name is Linda Vita, and I'm the head of the Water Resources Center Archives on the Berkeley campus, and we're sort of a major sponsor of the California Colloquium on water, and my staff do all the logistical arrangements. And so I'd like to acknowledge them, actually, Nancy Nowitzki and Trina Punders and Paul Atwood. They take care of... Thank you. And I also wanted to announce something that most people may not know, which is that we've been filming each lecture for many years, and we do have a video copy available to lend at the library. So if you know someone who's missed the lecture, they can check out a copy from the library. But just this semester, we have started also filming and encoding the lectures, and they're available on our website. So if you go to our website, you can actually watch the lecture. And of course, I have to plug our calendar, which is 2005, which is co-published by the Institute of Transportation Studies Library. We forgot to bring the flyers, but you can go to our website and order the calendar if you'd like. And I think that's it for the announcements. Thank you.
Introduce our speaker very briefly. Donald Pisani holds the Merrick Chair of Western American History at the University of Oklahoma, and is, I think, the preeminent historian of Western water and the West. He did his undergraduate and then went to, and got a master's degree at Berkeley, and then went to Davis to do his PhD in history, and then went on to an academic career at Texas and then at Oklahoma. His dissertation became a wonderful book, From the Family Farm to Agribusiness, which was published in 1984 by Press. And I was mentioning to him, I started teaching a course on the economics of water around that time, and I came across that book and devoured it, and have admired it and him ever since. He's published 3 other books: To Reclaim a Divided West, Water Law and Public Policy; another book, Water, Land, and Law in the West, The Limits of Public Policy, 1850 to 1920. And then a couple of years ago, Water and American Government, the Reclamation Bureau, National Water Policy, and the West. So I have great pleasure in turning this over to Donald Pisani.
For the very nice introduction, and thank all of you who made my visit to Berkeley possible. It's always a great pleasure to come back here because I have such wonderful memories of Berkeley before the storm. I graduated in 1964. So as my wife says, she was born in 1946, I was born in 1942. She said, we really are a different generation. She graduated from Stanford in 1968, and of course, our view of things, I had a crew cut, and so when I went in the Army, when I graduated, there wasn't much I had to do to put on a uniform. But it was a very different Berkeley, but in many respects, it kindled my interest in the American West, if sometimes indirectly. Tonight, what I want to do is give you a lecture that, in a sense, is précis of the book that the University of California Press published a couple of years ago called Water and American Government, that focuses on the first 3 decades of the 20th century and critical decades, I think, for the family farm and for many other aspects of water history. But let me introduce the topic, because I realize this is a mixed audience, and an introduction will be helpful for some of you by showing you some slides here. And I can handle this, right? So, okay. This is Frederick Haynes Newell, the first director of the Bureau of Reclamation, and I would argue perhaps the person who did the most to set the character of the Bureau at least into the high dam era in the 1930s, when the Hoover Dam, or Boulder Dam as I like to call it, started the era of high dams and the drift away from the family farm. He was born during the Civil War, educated at MIT. He was a mining engineer, not a hydraulic engineer, and he wasn't a Westerner. He had no experience with the West, and I argue tonight that that had a real impact on this program. He was a crony of Theodore Roosevelt, and he got his job almost purely for political reasons. Here's the president himself on horseback. This isn't, as many of you know, he spent some time playing cowboy in Dakota Territory in the 1880s, but this shows TR on horseback in Colorado, I believe, during his presidency early in the 20th century. He was very important because he made a critical political decision that I'll talk about tonight, and that was to spread the money as broadly as possible over the entire West instead of concentrating it in certain states where irrigation was most feasible. Here we have a political cartoon from a famous conservation journal of the early 20th century, Forestry and Irrigation. This is the classic theme of Western irrigation. On the top, the Western deserts as they are, wilderness. In fact, if you look over here, you can see a skeleton. The wilderness on the top, and down here, progress, civilization, government aid to irrigation is part of this, as the deserts can be transformed. This was the great dream, and it was a powerful dream for 1902. This is, many of you can visit this actually. This is Derby Dam over in Nevada, the very first works of any size to be completed, where the canal that linked the Truckee River and the Carson River diverted about half the flow of the Truckee River south into the Carson Basin. And here you can see all of the politicians out here for the dedication of this work, and up here is the train that carried them from Reno out to the works. This is the canal from a different direction, and very typical of the works that were built early in the 20th century. Another work here, this happens to be the Minidoka Dam on the Snake River in Idaho, and the reason I include it is these dams were designed as much to raise the water to the level of the land to be irrigated as they were to store vast sums of quantities of water. Virtually none of them, except perhaps incidentally, created hydroelectric power. That's something, of course, that comes along in the 1930s and after. This is the cover of the book that I published, that UC Press published a couple of years ago, called Water and American Government. This is the cover. And it means a lot. It's breaking the sod. But look at that man, and you can get some idea that this was not an easy job. And you also get an idea how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris, which was the song from World War I. There's not much that was efficient about this program, even though it was sold as being efficient. This is flood irrigation. Almost all of the land was flooded, which limited the kind of crops that could be raised as much as the soil, the absence of markets, and all sorts of other problems. Here they are flooding a field. Generally, they simply raised alfalfa, and that remains the most common crop on the former government projects. Very low-value crop. They promised, of course, everything from tobacco to citrus fruit, but very few of the projects raised high-value crops. Some did. The Yakima project had apples. The Salt River project had oranges, but most did not. But here you can see this is actually the shield of the Bureau of Reclamation in 1906, and you get a kind of warm feeling all over looking at this family farm here. Notice it is a very modest house by modern standards, but it would have been considered a comfortable cottage. You've actually got crops growing all around it. I imagine that's an outhouse, but you can imagine that picking this for the shield of the Bureau makes a statement about what the basic goals of the Bureau were. Now, the reality was something a little bit different from this. This is an early house. You can see two women and some children posed out in front. These are outbuildings, probably barns for livestock. Here another one. Some of these were claim shacks too. Started as claim shacks to establish claim to the government land, and then people lived in them for years. Here's one I like, the next two slides. The original house is on the right. The new house is on the left. Now, I think when you imagine living under those conditions with families of 3 or 4 children, you begin to get the idea of why farming wanes in popularity. Here's another same sort of thing. This was the original house. Now, that's quite a nice house and much more. These, incidentally, are photographs from the Bureau of Reclamation files. And that, let's see, it says up here, I can't remember which project this is. But in any case, you can see that my point is to illustrate the living conditions on these projects, focus on the people. And then finally, despite the promise that there were new towns and a new kind of social life that was going to come about because of the Bureau of Reclamation, this is Rupert, Idaho, a government town in 1906 or 1907. And it's about as dreary as you can imagine any place. Rupert, actually, you can go to Rupert today and it's still a dreary town. Not much has happened. And then finally, the Reclamation Bureau, one of the points I make tonight is the Reclamation Bureau was very good at publicity. If it was innovative in anything, I think it wasn't so much the engineering as it was the way it publicized its activities. It loved to show women having fun. And here's a young woman mowing alfalfa on the Truckee-Carson project out in Nevada. I can't imagine that very many women, particularly dressed like that, did this. But you find pictures like this all over the Reclamation Bureau photographic files. And in Reclamation Record and Reclamation Era, the magazines published by the Bureau. Then the final one here, this is a very suggestive picture that I'm almost certain was staged. Desert Ranch, H.J. Merstoff, proprietor, have faith in God and U.S. Reclamation. This is a fairly recent car there, and another one there. I had an aunt. Women used to wear dresses like that back in the 1940s, and every time I look at that woman, I think of my Aunt Gladys. Those nylon print dresses that were farm women wore in those days, and then, of course, the coveralls. But I suspect that this is in the 1930s, and the Bureau has sent somebody out with a sign and said, put this up. I think we could make a hell of a photograph out here. And you stand there with your wife. In the 1930s, because I judged the car probably 1920s, maybe early 30s, and I think what they're trying to say is, hang in there, Uncle Sam is going to help you. And that is the end of the slides, but I think you'll see that they tie into what I'm going to talk about tonight. Well, in 1902, Congress enacted potentially the biggest public works and demographic program ever undertaken in the United States, which was the construction of dams and canals to bring water to vast tracts of agricultural land in the American West. The intent was to create new homes for millions of Americans, particularly poor immigrants trapped in eastern cities. What happened to that mission, which began as a moral crusade and ended, in my judgment, as a moral disaster, is the story I want to tell you tonight. If you go to the United States Bureau of Reclamation's website and click on the heading About Us at the top of the home page, you'll learn that the Bureau has constructed more than 600 dams and reservoirs. You will also discover that the Bureau is the second largest producer of hydroelectric power in the western United States and the largest wholesaler of water in the country. We bring water to more than 31 million people, the Bureau's promo proudly proclaims, and provide 1 out of 5 Western farmers with irrigation water for 10 million acres of farmland that produce 60% of the nation's vegetables and 25% of its fruits and nuts. Yet the Bureau seems to have forgotten about the first decades of its life, decades that were more tragic than heroic in defining its significance to the nation. Other than a vague claim on this website that the water projects constructed by the Bureau, quote, led to homesteading, end quote, there's absolutely nothing about the Bureau's explanation of itself that relates to its original mission, which was promoting the family farm, creating new family farms in the American West. Our story begins in the 1890s, when millions of immigrants entered the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. East Coast cities grew at a spectacular rate, and the nation experienced an economic depression second in severity only to that of the 1930s. From 1893 to 1898, 1 in 5 factory workers lacked jobs, a fraction that climbed to 1 in 3 in 1894. In 1894 alone, 500,000 workers in the United States participated in 1,400 strikes. The fear that recent immigrants crowded into tenement districts of eastern cities would tear the nation apart, or at least infect it with what were called radical ideas, became epidemic. So did anxiety about class warfare. Social critics predicted that the industrial economy could never produce enough factory jobs to go around. There would always be a surplus of workers, and something had to be done with that surplus of factory workers. The Depression of the 1890s also had a devastating effect on the region west of the Great Plains. 90% of the population of the United States resided east of the Mississippi River in 1900, and the western half of the country was considered by many to be the American outback, a colony or economic dependency of the East. When the West mining and cattle industries began to falter in the 1880s, agriculture took up the slack. It was then widely believed in the United States that no economy could flourish without a sound agricultural foundation. Everything was built on agriculture, agriculture up. By 1890, irrigated land in the West had increased from 250,000 acres in 1870 to more than 3,600,000 acres. The increase was due to private land and water companies, which made their money by buying large tracts of land, subdividing it, and digging ditches to carry the water. Few private companies made their money by selling the water itself. But the Depression of the 1890s, and this is my point, dried up investment capital, and the future of the West seemed cloudy at best. Enter the first director of the Reclamation Bureau, Frederick Haynes Newell. Ralph Waldo Emerson once remarked that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. and the early Bureau of Reclamation reflected the character and values of Frederick Newell. He was born in Bradford, Pennsylvania in 1862. He graduated from MIT with a degree in mining engineering and joined the U.S. Geological Survey in 1888. He quickly rose through the ranks of that agency until the Depression of the 1890s hit. That resulted in a sharp decline in federal spending through the 1890s. So for the first decade of his career, Newell always had to be worried about whether he was going to have a job in a year or two, and he had to create himself into a job. As part of the U.S. Geological Survey, Newell learned to move in the Washington establishment. He joined the Cosmos Club. He served as an officer in many scientific organizations, including the National Geographic Society. He cultivated powerful friends, such as John Wesley Powell, G.K. Gilbert, Henry Gannett, W.J. McGee, and the forester conservationist Gifford Pinchot. But Newell's big break came in the late 1890s when he became an advisor on conservation policies to the governor of New York. That man was Theodore Roosevelt, who would become president in 1901. And when Roosevelt became president, he looked kindly on both Gifford Pinchot and Frederick Newell. The Depression had lifted in 1898 or 1899. Prospects for renewed federal spending brightened, and Newell responded by flooding popular magazines and newspapers with articles arguing that the future of American democracy and American institutions, remember the legacy of the 1890s is a fear of class warfare, hostility to immigrants, and so forth. He writes a number of articles saying that the future of the republic depends on the perpetuation of the family farm. And that's the greatest job the federal government can do to sustain American institutions. The West had long, of course, been seen as a safety valve for the discontented and impoverished people of the East, so that wasn't new to him. Quote, "Since the time of the American Revolution," Newell observed, "the public lands have served as the outlet for the energies of the people. During hard times, men out of employment could go west, take up a homestead, and by their own labor secure a competence for their children." This was largely myth, but it was myth that had been repeated so many times in American history that I think a large number of Americans certainly believed it. As the population of the United States increased, Newell predicted, there would be a growing pressure for land, especially in times of depression when men seek work in vain. Those are his words. The American West then held the answer. As Newell put it, quote, "The deadened, profitless deserts need only the magic touch of water to make farms and homes for the surplus people of our overcrowded eastern cities, and for that endless procession of home seekers filing through Castle Garden." Castle Garden was before Ellis Island, the entrepot for immigrants. The irrigated deserts of the arid West could support a population as large as that of the entire United States in 1900, Newell predicted. Entire United States could be doubled in size if the West was reclaimed. But the government had to act fast. If it did not, the best land would be taken up and monopolized by private land, water, and livestock companies, raising the price of a farm far beyond what the urban poor could afford. The rhetoric used by those who supported a national irrigation program fed on itself, and soon the rhetoric eclipsed reality. A screen of sentimentalism, as in the words of one historian, clouded the judgment of many in Congress. In 1902, Congress authorized the U.S. Geological Survey to begin building dams and canals in the West. It acted out of fear that the Depression would return, and fear that the growing number of landless Americans posed a significant threat to Republican institutions and the stability of the nation, as I've said. The 1902 irrigation bill was very popular in the West and South, enjoyed considerable support in the industrial states of the North, which had suffered most from the Depression and unemployment, and was strongly opposed in New England, which had been suffering a loss of people, and the Midwest, where the greatest competition was, where the largest farm block was in those days. The vote on the Reclamation Bill in the House of Representatives was 146 in favor, 55 opposed, roughly 3-1. But more significant than the vote for and against were the 150 representatives who didn't vote at all. Many abstained because they didn't know anything about the West. Most members of Congress had never been in the West, had never certainly even visiting the West. But others were Republicans who were reluctant to oppose any measure favored by their president, Theodore Roosevelt. So they abstained rather than voting no. And that led to a very ironical feature of this legislation. 85% of the Democrats who had cast a vote favored the Reclamation Act, but only 62% of the Republicans who voted favored the Reclamation Act. Now, in 1902, there were several territories, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, had yet to enter the Union. And Theodore Roosevelt hoped that when they did join the United States, they would do so with congressional delegations loyal to the Republican Party. The West was Republican in those days, 1900, just as the South was Democratic. Well, I guess the West is still Republican for it. Roosevelt wanted to keep the West Republican. The Reclamation Act, which Newell had helped to write, authorized the federal government to use money from the sale of public lands in the West, land owned by the government, to finance the construction of irrigation projects, to get them started. Placed an absolute limit of 160 acres on the size of farms, although the Secretary of Interior could set the size of farms down to as low as 40 acres, and in some cases even lower than that, depending on the quality of soil in the project and the value of the crops grown in the project. The National Irrigation Program did not begin as a form of welfare. Those who filed on government land within the projects got their land for nothing, but they were supposed to repay the cost of the dams and canals in 10 installments. The farmers benefited from the program in two ways, from the government building these irrigation works. Unlike private companies, the federal government didn't have to make a profit on the public works it built or the water it delivered, and that, it was hoped, would dramatically reduce the cost of setting up a farm. But second, the government didn't have to charge interest on the debt that the farmers assumed. So the total cost of building each water irrigation project in the West was divided by the number of acres within that project to arrive at a per acre cost that farmers were supposed to repay. As farmers repaid their debt to the government, or so it was assumed in 1902, more money would become available to construct new dams and canals. In this way, the Reclamation Bureau would, in theory at least, tap a perpetual fund that would go on forever and water every acre in the West that was susceptible of irrigation, every acre of public land susceptible of irrigation. In the years from 1902 to 1906, construction began on more than 24 irrigation projects, at least one in every state and territory in the American West. Some were as small as a few thousand acres, some as large as the 200,000-acre Salt River project, which was the largest, near Phoenix, Arizona. The architects of federal reclamation considered the American hunger for farmland as insatiable. After all, nearly 400 million acres of virgin land had been opened to cultivation, most of it on the Great Plains, in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. That was a landmass 4 times the size of California. And since Newell and others were expected that federal reclamation would irrigate no more than 100 million acres in the arid West, it was assumed that farmers would very comfortably take up all that 100 million acres of land. If they'd taken the 400 million before, why could they not take up the 100 million after it was irrigated? But I think it's important to remember the Reclamation Bureau had ambitions outside the arid West, and this is a point I make at some length in my book. It was assumed by Newell and others who came from the Geological Survey that if reclamation in the West succeeded, Congress would extend reclamation to the fertile alluvial land along rivers, so they would start to drain swampland. They would drain land that was contributed to the federal government by the states. They would start to reclaim cutover land, forested land. There's a lot of cutover forested land up around the Great Lakes, as many of you know. A lot of swamp land that required drainage in the upper Midwest and in the American South. And I mentioned to you that the South strongly supported the 1902 law. One of the reasons it strongly supported it is they thought that the next step was going to be to reclaim the South. First the West, then the South. And some people said we can get another 100 million acres of family farms out of this land outside the arid West, mainly in the South. But what kind of homes would the Reclamation Bureau create in the West? One model was created by the popular writer William Ellsworth Smythe, who in 1900 published a very influential book called The Conquest of Arid America, which really provided a kind of blueprint to those who favored the law of 1902 as to what kind of West, new West, would be created by this 1902 law. Smythe challenged the common assumption that the West would long remain a backward part of the country. Instead, he argued that irrigation gave the West the hope of becoming the most advanced and most progressive part of the country. Smythe was a New Englander by birth. He favored agricultural communities which centered on the village rather than isolated farms. He thought that irrigation was a tool of modernization. Irrigation permitted farmers to raise high-value crops, such as oranges, apples, and nuts. By doing so, farms in irrigated districts could be smaller, and the communities in irrigated districts more compact. So Smythe envisioned self-sufficient farms that would be relatively immune to the boom and bust cycle so characteristic of the pastoral and mining West, and he thought that irrigation would be aided by the cheap hydroelectric power that could be produced by water stored for irrigation. The great cities of the western valleys will not be cities in the old sense, Smythe promised, but a long series of beautiful villages connected by lines of electric motor cars, which will move their products and people from place to place. So Smythe's vision of the New West was a land in which the sharp distinction between rural and urban America would disappear, and he hoped the agricultural village would decentralize the nation's industry as well as its population. In this sense, he was on the same page as Frederick Haynes Newell. Well, those who administered the National Irrigation Program were, of course, engineers, not political or social reformers. Nevertheless, particularly in the early years, they pandered shamelessly to the dreamers and visionaries who were less practical-minded and who'd helped push the 1902 law through Congress. Francis G. Newlands was a Nevada congressman who had sponsored the Reclamation Bill in the House of Representatives. He was not a Republican. In 1906, as the Reclamation Bureau finished building its first canals, Newlands predicted, quote, "In the near future, the Reclamation Service," the early name for the Reclamation Bureau, "will provide for well-planned towns in which the owners of the adjoining farms will gather for social, educational, and religious purposes. Reservations will be made for schools, libraries, churches, and public squares. Water, sewage, and electric light systems will be planned and provided, and thus farm life will lose much of its unattractiveness and isolation. Our frontier towns will not be, as heretofore, accidental growths, devoid of comfort and attractiveness. Collectivism will be employed with great economic advantage in comprehensive plans covering town development, sanitation, and architecture, and ending in the individualized home near the outlying farm, associated with all the advantages of religious, education, and social life. For the family farm to prosper, Newlands thought that it had to be linked to towns that would provide farmers and their families with the rich social life that had long been missing in the agricultural districts of the Midwest and the Great Plains. In 1906, the Reclamation Service drafted a plan for a model town. Traditional rectilinear town plots produced uniform and monotonous blocks and lots. uniform and monotonous buildings, and uniform and monotonous streets and roads that ignored the contour and character of the land. The new design that the Reclamation Bureau considered put the business district at the center of town, but instead of streets intersecting each other at right angles, 8 boulevards radiated out from the center of the government town like spokes on a wheel. This design permitted lots ranging in size from 36 by 140 feet in the business district to garden farms of 325 feet by 610 feet at the edge of town. Those who lacked the money to buy a farm on the nearby adjoining irrigation project could have one of these garden farms in town, work in town, plant an orchard, and eventually save enough money to acquire a farm too. Most of the Reclamation Bureau's projects contain government land, so in theory at least, the federal government could easily have, or could leave out the easily, could have created new towns and engaged in social planning. I've pointed out they had the plan. Proceeds from the sale of town lots might have been used to pay for schools, sanitation systems, electric lights, and other public services. But model towns posed many risks. Established communities which did not adjoin the irrigation projects would have howled with protest as their property values and prospects for an economic growth dimmed with these new government projects. And most project farmers wanted the proceeds from the sale of town lots on government land to go toward reducing the cost of irrigating the land, not to providing public services deemed essential by government engineers or know-it-alls in Washington. Then, too, many members of Congress resisted any form of what they called government paternalism in those days. They feared that if you created model farms in the West, you'd drain off the agricultural population of the East, not just its urban poor. As I've already mentioned, New England was declining. Why tax people in New England to build up farms in the West was a good question. It would be unfair. In 1908, on the floor of the United States Senate, a New Hampshire senator observed that providing farmers in the West with model towns and social services would be unfair to, quote, communities in New England where they, the farmers, are struggling to get a living on farms that are mostly rocks. Farmers that would be glad to have the government step in and build schoolhouses and sewers for them and make them as comfortable as the people are out on the prairies of the West, but we have never thought that we had a right to come to Congress and ask for that kind of help. In light of this critique, the Reclamation Bureau's initial interest in laying out model towns, in consolidating rural schools, in encouraging community life and community spirit quickly waned. Put simply, the Reclamation Bureau abandoned its early plans for social engineering. By 1909 or 1910, the Bureau devoted its entire attention to building dams and canals. Critics of the Bureau considered any form of government planning as un-American, evidence of a dangerous trend toward collectivism and socialism. But others thought that the irrigation projects might prove that the federal government could and should assume new responsibilities previously reserved to private enterprise. The biggest obstacle was money more than ideology. The reclamation program had been conceived of as self-supporting, and for some years the reclamation's budget was not subject to review by Congress. Soon after passage of the Reclamation Act in June 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, made a fateful decision. Early in 1902, Roosevelt had favored the creation of 2 or 3 model irrigation projects. He thought that in that way, the administration of the federal program set up a few model programs, learn from the mistakes, and only after those test projects, after you'd worked out the details of building irrigation projects in the West, should a full-scale program be launched. The problem in Roosevelt's mind is once the reclamation law passed Congress, a lot of Democrats started saying, we were really behind this, more even than the president. In other words, everybody wanted to take credit for this, particularly if they lived in the West. So now TR is in a difficult spot. And he decides that the future of the Republican Party in the American West demanded that he launch as many projects as possible as soon as possible. Since the experimental projects were likely to be built in states like California or Arizona that had a mild climate, a long growing season, and good soil, he knew that since certain states would be favored, the states that weren't favored, and I mean states like the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, that aren't exactly agricultural paradises then or now, he was going to lose votes there. That was his dilemma. So you had to give something to everyone. And he gives the U.S. Geological Survey the order, go full steam ahead and open as many projects as you can. I want at least one in every state and territory of the West, because that's the only way we're going to hold our Republican delegation or ensure that when the territory comes into the Union, that it will be Republican. Incidentally, in Oklahoma, down around Lawton, I'm sure most of you don't know where that is, but it's down where one of the first wildlife refuges was created in the United States. It's a wonderful wildlife refuge. There was a project down in Lawton, a pump project that completely failed. There was one up in Kansas. They were disasters, most of these projects, but it was a payoff to the folks out in the parts of the West that weren't as well favored as agricultural states as California was. So Roosevelt's decision to share the wealth, scatter money as broadly as possible, also limited the ability of the Reclamation Bureau to engage in social planning and led to all sorts of other problems. It also meant that so many projects were undertaken by 1906 or 7, about over 2 dozen. It depends on whether you count the ones that failed within a couple of years. But between 24 and 28 projects were launched between 1902 and 1906. All sorts of problems arose, but the fact that the government didn't have money meant that it couldn't create demonstration farms to teach these farmers what crops to grow. It couldn't provide low-interest loans for farmers to build houses, barns, or purchase farm equipment. And indeed, it didn't have the money to buy up the private land in these projects, because although the act favored government land, there was also a lot of private land in these projects. The only way to deal with land speculation and rising cost of farms would have been for the government to buy all the land within the projects. But it couldn't do that because it didn't have the money. So those who came later, after the first wave of people come in and get the public land, have to buy their farms from private interests, and they have to pay, well, sometimes as much as $70, $80 an acre. Very, very difficult problem for them. Well, we can't blame everything on Theodore Roosevelt. I think that those who administered the project in the early years made plenty of mistakes, and eventually it all came home to roost with Frederick Haynes Newell. He repeatedly claimed that his goal was homemaking in the West, the creation of new family farms. Yet he was no friend of farmers, and by the time he left office at the beginning of 1915, he was despised and vilified on most of these projects, including the Truckee-Carson project over there in Nevada, which would be the closest one of any size. There was one up in Orland, the Klamath project you've read about, the Yuma project down on the Colorado River. Those were the ones here in California. Well, why was Newell so little trusted by the farmers he served? The answer is that he was really a man of the 19th century, not the 20th. And he was a social Darwinist who looked at life as a struggle between the strong and the weak, and he believed that progress demanded that the strong should win out. As early as 1912, he suggested that the problem on the government projects, farmers complaining that they had to wait too long for water, that they didn't have the money to repay the government, that they were losing everything and had to flee the land. He suggested the problem on the projects was mainly due to a lack of character in those who had settled the projects. Quote, "The characteristics of present settlers are in many respects entirely different from those of the older pioneer communities," he wrote. "There is not the spirit of cooperation which ruled the early pioneers. In a 1913 letter to a friend, Newell observed that the more the federal government did for the settler, the more dependent on government assistance the settler had become. On the whole, he concluded, we have done too much in taking the initiative and in trying to expedite agricultural development. Newell drew a sharp distinction between the self-reliant, self-sufficient pioneer farmer of the 19th century and what he considered to be the lazy, self-indulgent 20th century farmer. The farmers on government projects were, in his words, quote, attracted by glowing accounts of the relative ease of acquiring wealth in the West, and with erroneous ideas concerning the conditions to be met. There has arisen a class which has been called the professional pioneer, always seeking for something a little better or for conditions where life will be easier, staying in any locality only a few months, and then again seeking El Dorado. Well, one stunning statistic stands out in this respect. 75% of the original settlers on these government projects had fled the land within 3 or 4 years, leaving all the capital that they'd brought behind on those projects. 3 out of 4 had failed within 3 or 4 years. And yet, this fact elicited no sympathy whatsoever from Newell. I've never seen a word that showed any sympathy for these farmers. He always thought they were freeloaders trying to get out of their debt to the government. He said, this is naturally to be expected, that is to say, the failure of all these farmers, as the first comers are usually the more restless members of a community, men who are always on the lookout for something new, and when they discover it, are anxious to dispose of their acquisitions and move on to still better opportunities. Well, he's forced to resign, Newell is, from the Reclamation Bureau in 1915, after which, delicious bit of an aside, after which he chairs the Civil Engineering Department at the University of Illinois and complains bitterly about that engineers aren't much better than farmers in terms of the direction that they will take from the top. He dies in 1931, convinced that federal reclamation had been a mistake. He writes a number of pieces in the early 30s saying we should never have had federal reclamation at all, that the farms of the humid half of the nation had been more than sufficient to feed the entire population of the United States. Newell's legacy lived on then, long after he left the Reclamation Bureau. But his most lasting legacy, most lasting contribution was how the Reclamation Bureau manipulated the press. It was one of the first to have a publicity agent and a whole staff of people who wrote articles and fed them to the press, sent out lecturers to talk about the Reclamation Bureau, and published magazines to publicize the activities. It planted hundreds of articles, sent them to newspapers, which you can see the same article reprinted in a Pittsburgh paper, a Salt Lake City paper, a San Francisco paper, and you know where it came from. Slideshows to civic organizations, particularly the before and after, the wilderness and civilization. That contrast, of course, was utterly gripping. It's the meta-narrative of American history, especially in 1900, before and after, wilderness, civilization. Countless articles about that. Reclamation Record, its magazine, was designed to win the support of state and local politicians as well as national politicians. It was sent free to every member of Congress, for example, and it specialized in rags to riches stories. Let me give you one of the most improbable that I ran across that I think is absolutely delightful. 1923, Reclamation Record ran an article on 2 women, a Miss Ward and a Miss Peebles, P-E-E-B-L-E-S. These 2 women were bookkeepers who lived in El Paso, Texas. They had taken up 2 acres, very small farm, on the nearby Rio Grande project in New Mexico, and they worked their farm on mornings, evenings, and holidays almost as a form of recreation. When they weren't bookkeeping, they were raising chickens, planting crops, and learning how to farm. They raised chickens, but they also raised corn and beets. They cultivate a small orchard where there are pear, plum, peach, apple, and apricot trees. Within 2 years, the women had paid for their land, this small start with these couple acres, and improvements. Except for the irrigating, the reclamation record noted, all the work is done by the two women, and so far they have been exchanging such practical Christmas and birthday gifts as an axe, a saw, a steam pressure cooker, and a wheelbarrow. Miss Ward is a maid of all work. She has built a quite presentable kitchen sink and drain board, poultry fence, and all gates on the farm. This is the last sentence in the article. Both women are members of the El Paso Egg Producers Association. Well, this raises all sorts of delightful possibilities. You can imagine what I was thinking about, what was going on this reclamation project and how what we might speculate about today. But the main story here is this is 1923. Agricultural depression descends on the United States after World War I in 1920. If Miss Ward and Miss Peebles can make a go of farming, two bookkeepers in El Paso, who the hell couldn't? And if those who can't are obviously, as Newell suggested, weak. Such success stories are designed then not just to attract new farmers, but to quell the complaints of established farmers. Not only were Ward and Peebles women, but they were women with no apparent agricultural experience. At least it's not noted in the article at all. They come on the land and they learn by doing. Irrigation agriculture, we know today, takes a lot of skill. It's a very difficult kind of farming, skill and knowledge. But that aspect of desert agriculture is entirely ignored in this article. Nor was it typical that project farmers planted orchards. The trees cost a lot, and it takes, as most of you know, 8 or 10 years before you get fruit trees to start bearing in most cases. Most new farmers raised forage crops like alfalfa and clover instead of high-value crops such as citrus or nuts, and that was their problem. It took them too long to get an income from their farm, and most of them failed. So we must assume, I think, that these women had a bankroll. Who knows what they were doing with those books that they were working on in El Paso? Somewhere they got the money to make a go of it there on their farm. It's also significant that the story never talks a lot about these women, but it never mentions the size of the house the women lived in or constructed on their farm, or what kind of community life existed on the Rio Grande project. What's important is it's entirely about the economics of farming. And by the 1920s, of course, the Reclamation Bureau assumes that it's conducting an economic rather than a social experiment. Now, during the 1930s and after, and one of my points in the book that I wrote is I don't make fun of this because I think this is a kind of sustaining idealism in the Bureau of Reclamation that even though it goes wrong, even though these farms fail, it is still the animus of the Bureau of Reclamation. And I have a theory that the Bureau of Reclamation begins to decline in the 60s and 70s after the family farm is abandoned, because then it is nothing but an agricultural boondoggle to most people. But perhaps we can get to that in the question and answer period. Even during the 1930s, even during the agricultural depression, it's still trying to create new family farms. A 1940 survey of Bureau of Reclamation projects looked particularly at new projects undertaken during the 1930s, of which there were 2 or 3. The Owhyhee, O-W-Y-H-E-E project in eastern Oregon is a case in point. 60% of the farmers on that project abandoned their land during the 1930s. And here are a few statistics that I think are really revealing. 75% of the houses that were constructed on the Owhyhee project cost less than $350. Half of the houses built on the Owhyhee project as residences had only 1 or 2 rooms, even though the average size family on the project numbered 5. 40% of the families on the Owhyhee project could not afford to dig wells, and many carried their drinking water 5 miles or more from its source to their homes. Chronic diseases such as typhoid fever went untreated because most of the project residents lacked the money to visit a doctor. The family farm receives a temporary reprieve after World War II. In 1946, the Reclamation Era, renamed the Reclamation Era Record, the magazine of the Bureau, became known as the Reclamation Era. 1946, the magazine predicted that the Bureau, after World War II, would provide as many homes to returning World War II veterans as it had created from 1902 to 1945, all the homes it had created before that. And it looked particularly at the Columbia River Basin in Washington State. This was a project originally designed in the 1930s, you may know, to divert farmers from the marginal land on the Dust Bowl area of the Great Plains and try to attract them into the Pacific Northwest, which wanted to attract new residents. The farmers did not come, either in the 1930s or later. By the end of the 1950s, the government project in the Columbia Basin, less than 20% of the farms that were susceptible of irrigation had been taken up by farmers. And even worse than that, these were not refugees from the Great Plains, poor farmers who came into the Columbia Basin from the Great Plains. Most of them were from the adjoining state, or from Washington State or Utah. They were not poor settlers. Over half had family assets of $20,000 or more, significant for that time. And in 1968, the Bureau of Reclamation, in a symbolic gesture, turns the Columbia Basin project over to local water users. And that's as important as the 1980 increasing the size of the farm to 960 acres, because I would argue that Floyd Dominy a number of times said, look, the family farm is dead. The Bureau is not in that business anymore. It's over. One historian has looked at the Columbia Basin project and said, the government made a good decision in getting rid of it. Quote, it would be a collection of family farms ranging from 40 to 80 acres, none of them capable of supplying their owners with a satisfactory living. The area would be a rural slum. It is for the best that this aspect of the project failed. This is the last gasp of the family farm, as you know, and as I've mentioned, the Bureau, in 1982, Congress raises the size of the farm that can receive cheap irrigation water from 160 to 960 acres, waives a lot of the other restrictions on large landowners on government projects. And in effect, in 1982, the 82 law tacitly acknowledges that the economic marketplace, not government, should determine the size of farms in the United States and how wealth would be distributed in the rural West. The high dams built by the Bureau of Reclamation had allowed it to find a new political constituency anyway in the 1930s and after in some of the West's biggest cities. Ironically, the dams built by the Bureau of Reclamation to provide water to businesses and factories in cities, of course, created urban jobs for former farmers, some of whom left government irrigation projects and moved to the city to use Reclamation Bureau water in the factories that they worked at. Now I'm coming to a close. Of course, the family farm was doomed regardless of the national irrigation program, and technology has made agriculture vastly more productive, so farming simply cannot support as many families as it did a century ago. In 1900, 42% of Americans lived on farms. Today, only 2 or 3% do. And during the same century, the 20th century, the size of the average farm has more than tripled. Small farms do survive where high-value crops can be grown. The family farm is not dead. But usually such farms are highly capitalized, and the trend is to an economy of scale. Moreover, mass culture, the movies, radio, television, the internet, has obliterated the line between rural and urban America. There's no separate rural America that I can distinguish anymore, except in nostalgic TV shows like The Waltons, Little House on the Prairie, that inhabit the fringes of cable land. Finally, the advent of the consumer economy closely linked the rise of mass culture, closely linked to the rise of mass culture, has raised the economic expectations of farm families. By the 1920s, national magazines hawked automobiles, washing machines, phonographs, radios, and electric stoves. And as the decades wore on, the consumer culture enslaved farmers and urbanites alike. Farmers wanted to take vacations, see their children go to college, and enjoy what came to be called the good life or the American standard of living. I'm now at the end of this talk, but I want to leave you with a few conclusions. And there are a lot of things that we could talk about, and I hope we will when you ask questions and make comments. What does the story tell us? Well, time prevents me from talking about all of its implications, but a few of the most obvious. I want to emphasize at the outset, because some of my friends doubt this, that I am not a neocon, paleocon, or any other kind of con, nor am I a libertarian. I think that government has done much to improve the lives of ordinary Americans. Yet the Reclamation Bureau's attempt to resurrect the family farm demonstrates with a vengeance the law of unintended consequences. The broader and more ambitious the national policy, the more likely it is to miss the original goal. No one could anticipate in 1902 how the demand for new farmland would all but disappear in the 20th century, or how the consumer culture would revolutionize the way Americans define the good life and eliminate the notion that a subsistence was all that a farm should provide, or how federal subsidies to agriculture would end up benefiting agribusiness at the expense of small farmers. So before we try to bring freedom to the Middle East, we might consider how we have fared in trying to bring freedom to the United States. The record is spotty. The Civil Rights Revolution, for all its weaknesses, was an enormous accomplishment. But the campaign to save the family farm, I think, was a failure. Second, this is obviously an excellent example of the arrogance of power. The character of Frederick H. Newell should remind us that all too often the most idealistic and visionary people are also the most rigid and short-sighted. We shouldn't blame the Reclamation Bureau for events over which it had no control, yet the Bureau's leaders refused to accept their failures, even when those failures became painfully obvious. At first, they ignored or denied the problems government faced. Later, they blamed those problems on the farmers or on local politicians whom the Bureau claimed had built a constituency out of the discontented, or they blamed it on Congress. Never did the leaders of the Reclamation Bureau in the first few decades admit how badly they had miscalculated. It seems almost incredible that Frederick H. Newell was given charge of such an ambitious program, even though he was not a Westerner. He had never designed an irrigation system. He didn't know much about the practical problems of farming in the arid West, and he knew almost nothing about the soils of the arid West. Nevertheless, I think, insofar as I can find a silver lining in this story, here it is. In some ways, this represents the triumph of government, not its failure. The government was, in effect, called in to mop up after private enterprise had failed. That's why government got into the business in 1902. If there hadn't been a depression in the 1890s, I don't think there ever would have been a Reclamation Act of 1902. Federal reclamation then was a last resort. Capital had dried up in the 1890s, and this was a way of priming the pump. It was a way of ensuring the economic future of the West. But my point here is that federal reclamation might have turned out far worse, except that American federalism dispersed power to all levels of the government, thwarting the plans of those who sought to centralize control in Washington and escape all accountability for their actions. For once, Congress contained a program that could have been far more costly, far more extensive, and far more disastrous. The political system worked slowly and painfully for the people, for the farmers, the subjects of this government experiment. But from the perspective of people living today, I think that it's well that this program did not succeed. Many problems cannot be solved by private enterprise. Some problems can't be solved by government or private enterprise. And incidentally, that distinction, just like the rural-urban distinction, breaks down when we look at it. Of course, private enterprise and government are one in most cases. And I think saving the family farm was one of those goals that couldn't be, one of those problems that couldn't be solved by either private enterprise or government. That's all I have to say on that. Why don't we talk about any questions or comments you have? Thank you. Nancy.
When they were conceiving reclamation to draw the urban core from eastern cities, a lot of immigrants, who were the settlers? Were they the people who were the intended settlers?
Good question. Actually, you did have a lot of immigrants. Various projects had different, for example, on the Minidoka project which was in Idaho, you had a lot of Ukrainians. And about 10% of the people on the project voted socialist. And that was of deep concern to the Reclamation Bureau. That was one of their complaints. Not only were these people soft, they were soft because they were socialist. Because socialists looked at a form of cooperation that was antagonistic. Every project had different people, including Native Americans. Some of the projects had sections, the Yakima project, for one, because what the Bureau was doing was following a kind of imperialistic policy. It recognized the Dawes Act, you remember, which was the Allotment Act, which took Indian reservation land, divided it up. Well, if you irrigated the land, you could get the allotment down to as little as 10 acres. So many of these projects had, including the one out in Nevada, took Indian land, promised them a water right for 10 acres, and the Indians sometimes farmed in small numbers, but usually did not succeed. So every project had different people. Most were not penniless, because how would you get out to the west to begin with? You had to have something. But most of them did not have the adequate capital, and so they, I think initially the Bureau had hoped that they would have the money to be able to provide loans to farmers to get set up. But as I've suggested, the decision to open so many projects so fast, and the 19th century vision of farmers being responsible for their own destiny worked against that. Sir?
Your analysis highlights how the projects fail by stated goals.
Yeah.
Implicit and really explicitly at times, you also note how other kinds of goals, such as TR's motivation regarding Republican control of the West, and then maybe Congress's motivation in expanding the size of this 1982, may have also been work. I wonder if you could comment on how well the other kinds of goals of particular parties, in particular the distributive allocation of the benefits of these projects, may have actually achieved the goals of some who were motivated to keep it going. In fact, while the family farm may have failed, it may have actually achieved a number of other goals that explain why it persists today as a major force in the West.
Well, unquestionably, that's what the Bureau of Reclamation has always argued. They've always argued that the collateral benefits, if you took the value of the crops raised on all the farms in the projects in 1 year, that more than equaled the debt of farmers for all the construction costs. If you took the number of jobs created in towns around the projects, that would be another. Actually, later, of course, Floyd Dominy becomes a master at this. He says, look at the Lake Powell, the Lake Mead, the reservoirs behind these dams have more visitors per year than all the national parks. And he was right. I mean, if you wanted to measure it simply in terms of that as a benefit, a recreation benefit, it certainly was a benefit to a lot of people. It was boaters instead of the people who went to the national parks. But he knew very well that this was a different class of people and that the Reclamation Bureau was looking for votes among different people than went to the national parks. So you can certainly, I think the best answer I can give is that you can certainly construct a scenario that federal reclamation created more wealth than it cost. But I'm not sure that that's exactly the question you're asking. All I'm saying is that, of course, it failed to live up to its original goal and that this was a disastrous social program. On the other hand, you can find lots of countries that have had much more disastrous social collectivization in Russia. You know, we could go down the list of various social programs that have been far worse than this program. The Bureau, I think, to this day, complains. I was introduced as being one of the foremost critics of the Bureau of Reclamation by the historian of the Bureau of Reclamation at the centennial of the Salt River Project a couple of years ago in Phoenix. And I said, I said, you know, historians are supposed to be critical. Our job is to look at the past in a critical way. And while we may overreact, I've always thought that I tried to look at all, you know, as many of the elements that played into decisions as possible, and ultimately take a kind of Greek view of things, that history is ultimately tragedy. You know, that I wasn't trying to be critical of the Bureau. So I'm attacked by the Bureau as being too critical, and some of my friends say, wait a minute, you're anti-New Deal. I don't like this. This is troubling to me. You know, I've had several tell me, you mean the TVA wasn't good? And I said, I wasn't talking about TVA. So I think you can get attacked from both directions in a climate, although there's so many other things to attack today that this is small potatoes. Sir?
You mentioned collectivization in your answer to the last question. Are there any programs similar to the bureaus in other countries that have been resounding successes? In their original objective?
No, I don't believe so. And in fact, if you take the book, I have never had time to read it as closely as I should have, but James Scott's Seeing Like a State, which deals with collectivization projects in other countries, there's not a single one that he mentions that's a success. So I think that internationally the same thing obtains whatever the political system of the country. Large-scale planning tends to run afoul of events that people don't anticipate at the beginning. I think I'd leave it at that.
Yeah, if we assume that the family farm rhetoric was always a political cover throughout the history, and just look at it as expenditure of public funds for a public project, which may even have had a very low cost-benefit ratio, like BART, for instance, or the Washington, D.C. subway, or many, many capital expenditures by the public sector have always had irrational cost-benefit ratios. Mm-hmm. What's the alternative to what the Reclamation Project did? I mean, when you really look at it, forget about the rhetoric of the family farm. That is, would we have been better off in some kind of counterfactual world if something else had been done, if there hadn't been a Reclamation Bureau? Can you really make a case that the West or the country would be better off?
I don't know, because that raises so many different possibilities. I mean, you would have had the Army Corps of Engineers without the Bureau of Reclamation. That much is clear. And in the 1920s, the Corps of Engineers almost took over these projects. And as you know, some of the dams in California were built by the Army Corps of Engineers. So you really would have to say, would public works as done by the Corps of Engineers with no strings attached, with no pretext at social planning, have been better? And I don't know. History, as I think it occurred, is hard enough for me. The counterfactual history is impossible. So you will excuse me if I duck that beyond saying that I think there are a number of possibilities that could have happened. But most of those possibilities would have made the program, I think, even more costly and might have led, for example, when Elwood Mead came back from Australia, some of you know about Elwood Mead, he had a lot of grand ideas. It ended up that none of Elwood Mead's ideas succeeded any better than Newell's. So whether there was anything that Reclamation Bureau planners could have done, had they, let's say, laid out model towns, provided low-interest loans, would these farms have succeeded? I suspect not.
We have a portrait of Elwood Mead at the entrance of our building, by the way. But
he taught on this campus, right?
Yeah, very few people know who it is.
Well, just to tell that story, that portrait was hung in effigy. Elwood Mead, after he left Washington, became chairman of the irrigation project, a water district in the Sacramento Valley. And it failed in the 1920s. And that portrait hung over the fireplace in the main lodge of the water district.
Oh, you're thinking of Durham and Delhi in the 1920s, the two communities that failed. Right, yeah.
So when it failed, the disaffected farmers hung his portrait in effigy.
Yes.
And if you look, it's hanging in Giannini Hall. You can see they patched up the holes. There was a rod that cut holes in the I always point this out to the deans in our college and say, what happens to great... But I wanted to...
Well, let me just add to that the fact, remember, he goes to Washington as the Commissioner of Reclamation after Durham and Delhi have begun to fail. So he is Commissioner of Reclamation in Washington. In a way, he's kicked upstairs, despite the fact that his attempt to do this social planning in California has not succeeded. Yes?
I wanted to bring you back to counterfactual history, because your first book, The Family Farm, looks at the irrigation crusade. Before I read the book you talked about now, the history of the Reclamation movement, I had assumed that the motivating force for the Bureau of Reclamation was the sort of the breakdown of private finance of water development in the West. That the land and water districts had sort of run out of steam. And so the counterfactual history I'd like you to ask is, suppose the Bureau hadn't come along, and suppose there was no federal program to do anything. What would have happened to the history that you described
I think
in the 1980s?
Well, I think certainly these private districts would have made essentially the same mistakes that the government did, in that what happens is that actually between 1902 and about 1910, there's a terrible battle between the federal government and these local districts as to what's going to be undertaken. And you get some projects like you get a lot of irrigation districts. It's resuscitated in California in 1909, 1911. It becomes quite a viable institution, as many of you know. And many of those irrigation districts succeed, even though they had failed in the 1890s in California following the Wright Act. I don't know ultimately whether private... I still think the primary problem was that farming was getting too costly and the urban life was much more attractive. So I think those the social as much as the economic, I mean, after all, it is very hard work. Any of you who have relatives my grandparents had what I called a Manzanita ranch up near Nevada City. Had no indoor plumbing. I remember the outhouse with the wasps buzzing around. And while I liked to go up there and ride the horse, that was it. I mean, you wanted to get back to the city. Sacramento, as modest as Sacramento appeared to many people. I remember when I came to Berkeley as an undergraduate, people would actually say, "How can you stand to live in Sacramento?" You know, well, Sacramento's a nice place. I enjoyed growing up there. But when I looked at what these people, how they lived, I couldn't believe that anyone would choose this voluntarily. And of course, many decided not to. And I think those who stayed, well.
Because instead of looking back, look forward to what, you know, this myth of agriculture, and obviously in California today, agriculture is turning to urban, and we've got water involved with these. They still advertise themselves as farmers,
Yes.
and the farmers
Or
sell
growers.
their water to these urban areas. Yeah. And we still have reclamation around,
Yes.
but it's not talking about being family farms anymore.
Yeah.
What does this history look like going forward with reclamation in California look like?
I don't know. It's been a long time since I've lived in California, so my mind doesn't work in oh, you mean the water transfers? Obviously, there are going to be more and more of those, and the Reclamation Bureau the website obviously sent something when it went into the business of serving as a water broker, because it perceives that what its real job is not building new dams, not tearing them down, as much as some people have proposed that. It's finding a way to transfer water from one group of users to the other, whether Imperial Valley to Los Angeles and so forth, or to transfer water. You remember all the controversy over the Salton Sea and the birds dying there, restoring wetlands. I mean, there are a multitude of things that the Bureau of Reclamation did. That's a very good question. I don't hear people, it's not often where I come from, a state that just elected Tom Coburn, that the public interest is high on anybody's agenda. It's a quaint phrase that used to be, common in the political discussion, but I don't hear it much anymore.
The Cal EPA has this environmental justice program, action plan. Terry Tamminen came in and said, hey, this is the justice movement of the 21st century, and we've got to engage it as public trust agencies.
Well,
and so I'm floored.
I am too. How you implement it, I don't know, but obviously, I think there's a larger interest than simply water being transferred from one group of moneyed users to another group. I just don't, that's not, and I think that's my point about the family farm. There is something other than an economic equation that's important here. There are interests that are important. The question of whether there ought to be a rural America at all as opposed to an urban America is a question that people have to consider. Let's see, a couple more. This gentleman had a question.
I think it's pretty clear that the Central Valley Project wasn't built by the federal government. It would have been built by part of the state water project. Yeah. When you look at California, what happened later was the water development was for urban areas. Primarily.
Yeah, right.
And that's what happened. When you look at lots of the local irrigation districts that have been successful in California, Merced and Turlock and Modesto and Imperial. I mean, there's lots of examples where there was a lot of economic engine to drive it, and that wasn't for the family farms. It was for big agriculture and urban areas. That's what would have happened.
And the 160-acre limitation didn't apply in the Central Valley Project or the Imperial Irrigation District, Colorado Big Thompson,
Came along, they couldn't afford it, so they had to get bailed out.
Exactly. Sure.
I'm wondering how this interacts, the Reclamation Bureau's efforts interacted with several other kind of well-known American historical developments. One of them is, William Appleman Williams' presentation of, Imperial America as owing
Tragedy of American
as owing to these big, agricultural growers wanting to export their stuff. And here the Reclamation Bureau is trying to sound, just from your presentation, not because of anything I know, is trying to sort of go backwards to a sort of a family farm. It seems that those are contradictory, but I just ask your comment. The second thing is Frederick Jackson Turner's famous thesis, The Closing of the Frontier. I mean, this was 1892, and here in 1900, we're still trying to open up the frontier. And the third part is California, I understand, in the 30s was trying to recruit people to come out here. And owing to the Depression, all they got was Okies, which was what they didn't want, I guess. So I'm wondering whether you might be able to comment on how the reclamation efforts fit into it, these kind of other familiar aspects of American.
Those are really good questions. Let me see if I can remember them in order. The first one, actually, the Reclamation Bureau, one of the points made in 1902 when they considered this legislation was that the United States was going to avoid imperialism overseas by creating its own empire in the American West. That we had a kind of continental imperialism with this arid West, that we could first settle that instead of going into the Philippines or other countries for sugar. We could raise many of the crops we needed from overseas in the American West. The second question that you mentioned about Frederick Jackson Turner, obviously there's a very powerful sense of the closing of the frontier here. Because, in effect, what Newell and others were saying is We no longer have the humid land, that 400 million acres that I mentioned. Most of that land was, of course, in the humid part of the country, in the eastern plains or the middle of the Great Plains. I think that the notion that the Turnerian notion that the small farm was the foundation of the American economy in some way, that you could not get a diversified economy unless you had small farms, was such a powerful idea that it was almost unquestioned in 1902. And so, in effect, Newell and the others, and certainly the idea of wilderness and civilization, leaving out Indians, of course, well, or putting them in as part of the wilderness, is a part of that transition. So you've got powerful, I think we can never underestimate when we look at public policy, how powerful some of these meta-narratives is the phrase that historians use, or the term historians use. That is to say, they fit so comfortably with the larger American view of what this country is supposed to be all about. And certainly that was true of Turner, who is still the best-known American historian. And certainly I can't think of any theory that comes close to Turner for explaining American history, even though much of it was wrong. It lasted with an amazing durability well into the 1930s. Then the third question about the 1930s.
Wanted people to come out. It would seem that this would dovetail with a family farm type of project. I mean, I don't know what California wanted in terms of a person. They didn't want Okies. There was a big prejudice against them. But,
that's right.
But whether they wanted farmers as such.
Well, that's a very good question, because they certainly did not. On the one hand, the Reclamation Bureau is saying, let's take these people out of the tenement districts of the East. But those people were worse than Okies. I mean, they were radicals. They were bomb throwers. Can you imagine a reclamation project of Irish? You know, that's not something you wanted in 1902. So obviously there was an inconsistency there. And the states, I mean, growing up when I did in the 1940s in California, Okie was an opprobrious term. There was almost nothing that you could call someone that was worse than Okie in California. So clearly these people coming to California, but I would argue this too though. California was and is the great exception. If you're talking about Wyoming or Montana, Montana lost so many people in the 1920s and 30s, they would have taken anybody. Okies, Ukrainians, it really wouldn't have mattered there, because I think something we forget is that these states, the legal historian Harry Scheiber uses the term rivalistic state mercantilism, which is a wonderful term. These states competed with each other. And so states like Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas had to figure out how on earth are we going to get residents when California or Washington state have to offer what they do. So they're kind of left the off-scourings, it seems to me, and I suspect nobody's ever done this, but if you did a sociological study of all these projects, what you would find is the poorest projects, the Williston project in South Dakota, would have attracted the poorest immigrants. The Salt River project would have had the fewest immigrants and the most established farmers. But it would be interesting to see because, of course, California didn't have to compete for residents in the same way. Maybe in the 1930s during the Depression, but I never got the feeling that that was the case. Yeah. One more question? I'm happy to take all the questions that people have. Or comments.
Knowledge of Chinese history, but it appears they've succeeded in this whole project far better than the founder of all this started, and they're continuing today, even with the three-quarter stamp. But my question is...
Which incidentally, you know where that came from. Jack Savage, the Reclamation Bureau engineer, the original designs for the Three Gorges Dam were Bureau of Reclamation designs.
Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, The other question I have, did Teddy Roosevelt run in a progressive party because of this involvement, or was that another decision?
No, because the Republican Party wouldn't let him back to run for president in 1912 because they already had William Howard Taft, who had become president. To my knowledge, TR's interest in reclamation is the first 5 or 6 years, but he always had an emotional commitment to this. He thought that Newell had been unfairly treated. He thought that actually what had happened was that Newell had been attacked by members of Congress who were jealous or their states hadn't gotten enough irrigation projects or the attacks came from states that were agricultural competitors of the West and so forth. Neither TR nor Newell ever admitted that, that anything might have been done differently, anything at all. So when I hear political leaders defending the war in Iraq and, you know, what's new? This has been done many times by many people in the American past. It's not a new phenomenon, even though it's obviously regrettable.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.